Sometimes life gives us these moments, these tiny, split-second decisions that seem so small at the time, but they end up changing everything. And I mean everything. This is one of those stories, a story about a dance that lasted maybe 30 seconds, but changed three lives forever. So let me take you back to that evening. Picture this, the Sterling, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. We're talking about the kind of place where a single meal costs more than most people's monthly rent. Crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, soft piano music floating through the air, and tables full of New York's wealthiest elite. Everyone dressed to perfection, everyone speaking in hushed, polite tones. Everything perfect. But perfection, as we're about to see, can be shattered in an instant. At one of the best tables in the house sat Calvin Yang. Now, Calvin wasn't just wealthy, he was billionaire wealthy, owner of Yang Global Investments, the kind of man who could buy and sell companies before breakfast, the kind of man people whispered about, the kind of man who was used to getting exactly what he wanted, exactly when he wanted it. But tonight, Calvin Yang was nervous, and that was rare for him. Sitting across from him was his 10-year-old son, Daniel. And Daniel was different from the other children you might see in a place like this. His legs were supported by metal braces that caught the light every time he moved. 2 years ago, there had been an accident that had partially paralyzed his legs, an accident that had also taken Daniel's mother, Catherine, from both of them. This was the first time Calvin had brought Daniel to a public dinner since that terrible day, and already he was regretting it. He could feel the stares, the pitying looks, the whispered conversations at nearby tables. His jaw was tight, his shoulders were tense. He just wanted to get through this meal and go home. But then, as the piano started playing, it was a soft melody, gentle, the kind of music that makes you want to sway, maybe tap your foot. And something happened in that moment that Calvin didn't expect. Daniel's eyes lit up, not with fear or shame, but with something else. Something Calvin hadn't seen in his son's eyes for 2 long years. Joy. Daniel looked around the restaurant, and his gaze landed on Monica Rodriguez. She was a waitress, moving gracefully between tables, taking orders, clearing plates. She was also the only Latina woman working in that dining room. In her 5 years at the Sterling, Monica had learned to be invisible, to blend in, to serve the wealthy without being truly seen. But Daniel saw her, and before Calvin could stop him, before anyone could react, Daniel called out. His voice, small but determined, cut through the quiet conversations. "Excuse me, would you dance with me?" Time stopped. I mean it. Everything just froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Heads turned, and dozens of pairs of eyes fixed on this little boy with metal braces on his legs, his hand extended toward a waitress. The silence was so thick you could almost touch it. Calvin felt his heart drop into his stomach. Embarrassment flooded through him, hot and sharp. This was exactly what he'd been afraid of. Daniel drawing attention to himself, to them, making a scene. And then, cutting through that terrible silence, came the smooth, cold voice of Manager Harrison. "Sir, please control your son." Each word was like a slap. "This is inappropriate. This is not a dance hall, and our employees are not here to entertain children." Calvin's face burned, his hands clenched into fists under the table. When he spoke, his voice was low but firm, the voice of a man used to being obeyed. "Daniel, sit down." But Daniel's hand was still extended, still reaching out, still hoping. And Monica Rodriguez stood frozen, caught between the manager, the billionaire, and this brave little boy who just wanted to dance. In that moment, Monica had a choice to make. She could do what was expected, what was safe. She could apologize, bow her head, and walk away. Keep her job, stay invisible. But here's the thing about Monica that nobody in that restaurant knew. She wasn't just a waitress. She had a bachelor's degree in child development from Columbia University. She'd been working on a master's in special education before life got in the way. And for the past 6 years, she and her sister had been running a dance program for children with physical disabilities. So when Monica looked at Daniel, she didn't see a disruption. She didn't see inappropriate behavior. She saw a child asking for connection, for dignity, for a moment of normalcy in a world that constantly reminded him he was different, and she made her choice. "Mr. Harrison," she said calmly, her voice steady, "I'm leaving. My shift is over." She reached up and untied her apron, placing it carefully on a nearby table. Then, to the absolute shock of everyone watching, she smiled at Daniel, a warm, genuine smile. "I can't dance with an apron on," she said, and she took his hand. Calvin shot to his feet. "What do you think you're doing?" Monica met his gaze without flinching. "I'm accepting an invitation, sir." Before anyone could interfere, before Calvin could stop it, Daniel took a step. His first step toward the open space between tables. His foot dragged across the polished floor. The metal of his braces clinked loudly in the silent restaurant. It was painful to watch. Awkward. Difficult. "He'll fall," a woman at the next table whispered to her companion. But Monica didn't try to guide Daniel. She didn't try to support him or rush him. She didn't do what everyone always did: take over, help, fix, correct. Instead, she did something revolutionary. She followed. She adjusted her pace to match his. When he moved slowly, she moved slowly. When he paused to gather his strength, she waited. She let him lead. And as Calvin watched, frozen in place, something inside him broke open. A memory hit him like a wave. Catherine, his late wife, dancing with Daniel in their living room. Daniel must have been 5 or 6 before the accident, before everything changed. He could hear Catherine's voice so clearly, as if she were standing right beside him. "It's not about perfection, Calvin," she'd said, laughing as Daniel stepped on her toes. "It's about connection." Now, watching his son take these painful, difficult steps across a restaurant floor, Calvin finally understood what she'd meant, because something was changing in Daniel's eyes. The fear that had been there moments ago was fading, replaced by intense concentration. The shame that Calvin had seen so often on his son's face was giving way to something else: pride. For the first time since the accident, Daniel wasn't being guided. He wasn't being helped or corrected or managed. He was leading, and someone was choosing to follow. Manager Harrison's voice cut through the moment again. "Mr. Yang, I assure you this will never happen again. She will be properly disciplined." Calvin didn't respond. He couldn't, because all he could see was his son's face, the smile booking across Daniel's features, the confidence in his posture, the way he held his head high. The entire restaurant was watching, waiting for Calvin Yang's reaction. After all, everyone knew who he was. Everyone knew his power. One word from him could end Monica Rodriguez's career, could get her fired, blacklisted, forgotten. The staff had stopped working. Other diners watched with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. The tension was unbearable. But all Calvin could hear was his son's laughter, that beautiful sound he hadn't heard in so long. 3 steps. That's all it was. 3 painful, difficult, beautiful steps across a restaurant floor. And then Monica guided Daniel back to the table, never once rushing him, never once making him feel like a burden. When they reached Calvin, Monica looked down at Daniel with genuine respect, as if she were speaking to an equal, not a child, not a disabled child, just a person. "Thank you for asking me," she said formally. "It was an honor." And that word, honor, it hung in the air like a bell that had been rung. As Monica turned to leave, to walk away and face whatever consequences were waiting for her, Calvin heard his own voice. It sounded different, almost unrecognizable. "Wait." She stopped, turned back. "What's your name?" "Monica Rodriguez, sir." Calvin nodded slowly, as if committing it to memory, as if this moment, this woman, this name mattered. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out his business card. His hand was steady as he held it out to her. "My office, tomorrow at 10 a.m. You could have heard a pin drop. The entire restaurant held its breath. Monica reached out and took the card, her hand trembling just slightly, but her face showed nothing. No fear, no hope, nothing. "Dad." Daniel's voice was small as Monica walked away. "Why did you do that?" It sounded like an accusation. Like Daniel thought his father was going to punish the one person who had shown him kindness. Calvin looked at his son, really looked at him. And for the first time in 2 years, he saw more than just the accident, more than just the disability, More than just the problem he'd been trying to manage and fix and control. He saw a complete human being, a person with needs and desires and dreams that Calvin had been systematically ignoring because he was too busy trying to protect him, too busy trying to maintain control. As dinner continued in strange, awkward silence, no one noticed the look in Monica Rodriguez's eyes as she left the Sterling for the last time. It wasn't fear, it wasn't resignation, it was determination. Because Monica Rodriguez had a plan, and Calvin Yang had just walked right into it. The next morning, the lobby of Yang Tower gleamed with wealth and power. Glass walls stretched up toward the sky. Marble floors reflected the morning sun. Everything was chrome and sharp edges and expensive. Monica Rodriguez stood in the middle of all that wealth wearing her best outfit, a navy skirt and white blouse that she'd bought on sale 3 years ago. Her purse was worn at the edges. Her shoes were comfortable but old. She looked around at the people flowing past her. Their clothes probably cost more than her monthly rent. Their watches could pay off her student loans. They moved with the easy confidence of people who belonged in places like this. Monica didn't belong here. She knew it. They knew it. But she was here anyway. Monica Rodriguez to see Mr. Yang, she told the receptionist, who looked her up and down with cool assessment before making a call. 18th floor. Mrs. Palmer will see you. In the elevator, Monica took a deep breath. Her reflection stared back at her from the mirrored walls. She looked small, out of place, but her eyes were steady. She wasn't afraid. She'd faced much worse than billionaires and glass towers. Mrs. Palmer was waiting on the 18th floor, a woman in her 40s with perfectly styled hair and a gaze that could cut glass. Mr. Yang is finishing a conference call. Please follow me. As they walked through the executive offices, Monica felt the stares. A Latina woman being escorted through these halls was unusual enough to cause whispers. She could feel the speculation, the curiosity, the judgment. You've been fired, haven't you? Mrs. Palmer said suddenly when they were alone in a waiting room. Her voice was matter-of-fact, almost sympathetic. That's what happens. Powerful clients call, and people like you lose their jobs. People like me? Monica's voice was calm. Employees who don't know their place. Monica smiled, but there was no humor in it. And where would that be exactly? Before Mrs. Palmer could answer, her phone buzzed. He'll see you now. Calvin Yang's office was massive. It took up half the floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over Manhattan, making the city look like a toy. Something small and uncontrollable. Calvin stood with his back to the door, looking out at his kingdom. Mr. Yang, Monica said formally. He turned. Mr. Rodriguez, thank you for coming. He gestured to a chair. Please. The silence that followed was calculated. Monica recognized it immediately. This was a power play. The kind of silence meant to make people nervous, to make them talk too much, reveal too much, incriminate themselves. But Monica had nothing to hide. You have a background? Calvin finally asked. Excuse me? Education, college. Bachelor's degree in child development from Columbia. Incomplete master's degree in special education. Something flickered across Calvin's face. Surprise. And you work as a waitress. I work 3 jobs, actually. The restaurant, a bookstore on weekends, and as a tutor when I can get students. Calvin moved to his desk, picked up a folder. I did some research on you, Miss Rodriguez. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, uncertain. I wanted to understand who the person was who danced with my son. He opened the folder. Inside were printed photos of a community center, children in wheelchairs, children with prosthetic limbs, children with braces like Daniel's, all of them dancing. Liberty Movement, Calvin said. You founded that 6 years ago. Monica sat up straighter. I co-founded it with my sister Sophia, a dance program for children with physical disabilities. Calvin leafed through the documents, which is now about to close due to lack of funding. Of course he'd found all this out. In less than 24 hours, Calvin Yang had uncovered Monica's entire life. I didn't come here to ask you for money, Mr. Yang. Then why did you come? Because you invited me. Calvin actually laughed at that, a short, joyless sound. Fair enough. He stood, started pacing. Calvin Yang was not a man who sat still easily. I want you to work for me. Monica blinked. Whatever she'd been expecting, it wasn't that. As a waitress in your home? Calvin's face hardened. For Daniel. The name seemed difficult for him to say. Monica noticed his eyes drift to a photo on his desk. A beautiful woman holding a baby. Catherine. Daniel's mother. Calvin's late wife. I have the best specialists in the country, Calvin continued. Physical therapists, neurologists, psychologists. But what you did yesterday, he paused, searching for words. It was remarkable. I don't want a dancer for my son. I want someone who can do what you did. Follow, not lead. Monica studied the man in front of her. Beneath all that wealth and power and control, she saw something else. Something most people probably missed. A desperate father. A lost man. Someone who had no idea how to help his own son. I can pay you 5 times what you're making now. 5 times. Monica did the math in her head. That would solve so many problems. Her student loans, her sister's medical bills, the community center's funding crisis. She stood up. No. Calvin looked like she'd slapped him. What? No, Mr. Yang, I won't work for you. You're turning down an offer that would solve your financial problems? His voice rose. Out of pride? Out of dignity, Monica corrected gently. And because your son deserves more than someone hired to pretend to care. She walked toward the door. You don't know my son, Calvin said. Monica stopped, turned back. No, I don't. But I know people like him. People whose physical limitations are nothing compared to the invisible cages we build around them. She reached into her purse and pulled out a card, placed it on his desk. Liberty Movement. Classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays, 4 p.m. If you'd like to bring Daniel, the first class is free. And then she walked out. Mrs. Palmer was waiting in the hallway, her eyes wide. You just turned down an offer from Calvin Yang, she whispered. Are you crazy? Monica smiled, a real smile this time. Maybe, but I'd rather be crazy than owned. As she rode the elevator down, as she walked out of Yang Tower back into the real world, Monica Rodriguez knew something that Calvin Yang didn't know yet. The game had just begun. And she was playing for much higher stakes than a job. She was playing for Daniel's freedom. For every child like him, for dignity, for change. And billionaires like Calvin Yang, they were used to buying what they wanted, but some things can't be bought. And Monica was about to teach him that lesson. You know what's funny about powerful men? They're used to getting their way. Always. When someone says no to them, it doesn't compute. It's like their brains short circuits because the word no just doesn't exist in their world. So picture Calvin Yang standing in his massive office, holding Monica Rodriguez's card. Liberty Movement, a community center in a part of town he probably hadn't visited in 20 years. Classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 4 p.m. First class, free. Free. Like he needed anything for free. But here's what Calvin couldn't stop thinking about. It wasn't Monica's refusal, though that stung. It wasn't even the money he'd offered that she'd turned down. It was Daniel's face. That smile. That moment of pride when he'd taken those 3 painful steps across a restaurant floor. Calvin had hired the best specialists money could buy, the best physical therapists, the best doctors. He'd spared no expense trying to fix his son, but in 2 years, he'd never seen Daniel smile like that. Not once. So on Wednesday, 5 days after that dinner at the Sterling, Calvin found himself doing something he never did. He cleared his afternoon schedule. He told his assistant to cancel his meetings, and he got in his car to Daniel. Where are we going, Dad? Daniel asked from the back seat, his eyes bright with curiosity. Calvin gripped the steering wheel tighter. You'll see. At Liberty Movement, Monica was at the reception desk when Sophia came running in, breathless. There's a luxury car outside, Sophia said, her eyes wide. A really, really expensive one. Monica looked up from her paperwork. Through the window, she could see a black Mercedes idling at the curb. Daniel was in the back seat, his face pressed against the window, looking at the building with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. And Calvin was still in the driver's seat. His hands were on the steering wheel. His jaw was tight. He looked like a man at war with himself. He's not coming in, Sophia predicted. Men like him don't come to places like this. But Monica was smiling. That small, knowing smile she got when she was 3 steps ahead of everyone else. "Don't underestimate the power of a determined son," she said softly. They watched, waited, and then slowly Calvin got out of the car. He helped Daniel out, adjusted his braces, and the two of them stood on the sidewalk looking at the old warehouse that housed Liberty Movement. Calvin looked so out of place. He tried to dress casual, khaki pants and a sweater instead of his usual $1,000 suit, but everything about him still screamed wealth, privilege, power. "You were right," Sophia whispered. "He actually came." Monica didn't answer. She was too busy watching the way Daniel pulled his father toward the door, the way Calvin resisted for just a moment, then gave in, the way a son was leading and a father was learning to follow. Liberty Movement wasn't fancy. It operated out of an old community warehouse with concrete floors and exposed pipes. But the walls were covered with handmade posters. "Your rhythm, your rules. Every move counts. Dance like nobody's watching, because they're too busy dancing." And everywhere there were children, children in wheelchairs, children with prosthetic limbs, children with braces, children with crutches, all of them moving, swaying, dancing to a light, steady beat. It looked, to Calvin's eye, completely chaotic. "Mr. Yang," Monica approached, wearing simple workout clothes, leggings and a t-shirt. She looked so different from the waitress in the uniform. More herself, more comfortable. "I'm glad you came." Calvin looked around, visibly uncomfortable. "It looks chaotic." Monica smiled. "There is structure, it's just not the one you recognize." She turned to Daniel, who was staring at the other children with wide eyes. "Would you like to join in?" Daniel nodded enthusiastically, but then looked at his father. That automatic check for permission. That constant need for approval. "Go on," Calvin said, his voice tense. "I'll be right here." As Monica guided Daniel toward a group of children near his age, Calvin took a chair along the wall. He sat stiffly, his hands on his knees, watching everything with the careful attention of a man in unfamiliar territory. Sophia approached him, holding a clipboard. "The first day is always the hardest," she commented, sitting down beside him. "For the children?" Calvin asked. "For the parents." Calvin didn't respond to that. Instead, he said, "This isn't therapy. I hired the best rehabilitation specialist in the country for Daniel." "And how has that been working?" Sophia's question was gentle, but it hit like a hammer. Calvin opened his mouth to defend himself, to explain all the progress, all the improvements, all the medical reports. But then he stopped. Because the truth was, Daniel had made progress with the specialist. His muscles were stronger, his balance was better, the medical markers were all improving. But his spirit, that had been dying a little more each day. Before Calvin could respond, the studio door opened. An older woman entered. She must have been in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun. She walked with a cane, but there was nothing frail about her. She had the kind of presence that made people stop and pay attention. "Dr. Margaret Williams," Monica said, moving to greet her. "Calvin, this is Dr. Williams. She's a neuroscientist specializing in brain plasticity, retired from Stanford." Calvin stood automatically. Dr. Williams looked at him with sharp, assessing eyes. Mr. Yang," she said, "you've rejected my research proposal 3 times in the last 2 years." The words hung in the air. Calvin blinked. "I'm sorry, I don't." "The Yang Foundation," Dr. Williams continued, moving past him to greet several children. "I submitted proposals for funding a study on non-directive movement therapy for children with motor challenges. 3 times. 3 rejections. Never even got a meeting." Calvin felt the pieces clicking into place. He looked at Monica, who was watching him with that same calm, determined expression. "You knew who I was," Calvin said slowly. "At the restaurant, you knew." Monica met his gaze without flinching. "From the moment you walked in." "And the dance, that was all." "Daniel chose to get up," Monica interrupted firmly. "Daniel chose to ask me. I just chose to say yes." "But you knew this would happen," Calvin insisted. "You knew I'd invite you to my office. You knew I hoped," Monica corrected. "I saw an opportunity, and I took it. But everything that happened was real, Mr. Yang. Your son's courage was real. His smile was real. And what he felt in that moment, that was real too. Calvin felt anger rising in his chest. He was being manipulated. This woman had orchestrated everything. But before he could speak, before he could express his outrage, Sophia came running over. Monica, you need to see this. It's Daniel. They all rushed back into the main studio, and what Calvin saw stopped him in his tracks. Daniel was in the center of the room. The music had been turned off. All the other children had stopped what they were doing. Everyone was watching, because Daniel was trying to balance on just one support, one crutch. Daniel, Calvin started forward, his heart in his throat. His son was going to fall. He was going to hurt himself. This was too much, too soon, too dangerous. But Monica's hand caught his arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Wait, she whispered. Watch. He'll fall, Calvin said desperately. Maybe, Monica agreed, but maybe he won't. And don't you think that's his choice to make? Calvin stood frozen, every instinct screaming at him to intervene, to protect, to prevent, to control. But he didn't move, and he watched his son. Daniel's face was screwed up in concentration. His entire body was shaking with the effort. The one crutch was barely holding him up. He looked like he might collapse at any second. But then, slowly, painfully, beautifully, Daniel lifted his right foot off the ground. Just an inch, just for a second. But he did it. He balanced on his left leg, the weaker leg, the one that had been most damaged in the accident, for one breathtaking moment. And then he took a step, a real, complete step without full support. It was small, it was shaky. It lasted maybe 2 seconds before he had to catch himself. But it was his, entirely, completely, absolutely his. The room erupted. Children cheered, staff applauded. And Daniel stood there, tears streaming down his face, looking at his father with an expression Calvin would never forget. Not pride, not triumph, joy, pure, unfiltered joy. Calvin felt something break inside him, something that had been locked away since Catherine died, since the accident, since the day he decided that protecting Daniel meant controlling everything about his life. That's why we created Liberty Movement, Monica said softly, standing beside him. It's not about perfect steps. It's about first steps on your own terms. Calvin looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not a manipulative waitress trying to get his money, but a woman who understood his son in ways he'd forgotten how to. This could have been done without manipulating me, he said finally. Monica nodded. It could have been. If you had answered our calls, if you had read our proposals, if you had given us even 5 minutes of your time. 3 times, Calvin said, remembering Dr. Williams's words. 3 times, Monica confirmed. So yes, I saw an opportunity at that restaurant, and I took it. I'm not sorry for that. But I didn't make Daniel ask me to dance. I didn't make you give me your card. I didn't make you come here today. Those were your choices. A reporter was suddenly in front of them. Then another, then a whole group. Cameras, microphones, questions being shouted. Calvin tensed. What is this? Sophia was handing out press releases. Monica was smiling that small, strategic smile. Part 2 of the plan, she said. A reporter thrust a tablet at Calvin. On the screen was an article, Revolutionary Motor Rehabilitation Methodology Shows Promising Results. Local program offers hope for children with motor challenges. We published our first research results today, Dr. Williams explained, joining them. Preliminary, but very promising. You used my son, Calvin said, his voice dangerously quiet. For a publicity stunt. No, Monica said firmly. She took his arm and led him into a side room, away from the reporters and cameras. The walls were covered with photos. Dozens of children, hundreds of them. Each photo had handwritten notes beside it. Progress statistics, personal stories, dreams achieved. At the end of the wall was an empty frame, just a frame with nothing in it. What's that? Calvin asked. Our future, Monica said. The full rehabilitation center we could build if we had the resources. 500 children a year instead of 50. Real research facilities, trained staff, equipment, scholarships for families who can't afford anything else. She turned to face him. I didn't use your son for publicity, Mr. Yang. I used your power, your influence, your name. Because children like Daniel deserve more than what we can offer them in an old warehouse with donated equipment and volunteers working for free. You manipulated me. I gave you an opportunity, Monica corrected, to see what you'd been refusing to see, to understand what you'd been too busy to learn, to meet your own son as a complete human being instead of a problem to be fixed. Calvin looked at the photos on the wall, at the empty frame waiting for a future that might never come. 4 months ago, Monica continued, I sat in the reception area of your foundation office for 3 hours. I'd made an appointment. I'd prepared a presentation. Dr. Williams was with me. We had data, research, testimonials. We had everything ready. And your assistant canceled our meeting 15 minutes before it was supposed to start. Said you were too busy. Offered to reschedule. We rescheduled 3 times. Each time you canceled. The last time, your assistant told us to stop calling. Monica's voice was calm, but Calvin could hear the steel underneath. So yes, when I saw you walk into that restaurant, when I recognized you from the photos on your foundation website, I knew who you were. And when your son asked me to dance, I saw a chance to make you see what you'd been refusing to see. I took it, and I'd do it again. Silence filled the small room. Outside, they could hear the reporters, the questions, the growing media presence. Calvin Yang stood at a crossroads. In front of him were 2 paths. One path, retreat in anger. Call his lawyers, destroy this program and everyone in it. Confirm everything the media said about him. Cold, calculating, ruthless. The other path, embrace this moment his son had created. Acknowledge his failures. Admit he'd been wrong. Between the power he'd always had and the freedom his son needed, Calvin found himself in completely unfamiliar territory. And for the first time in his life, he didn't know which choice to make. But then he remembered Daniel's face. That moment of pure joy. That smile that had been missing for 2 years. And he knew. He walked back into the main studio. The reporters swarmed immediately. Mr. Yang, can you comment on your presence at Liberty Movement today? Is it true that your foundation rejected funding for this program 3 times? Calvin looked at Daniel. His son was still practicing, still trying to balance, still pushing himself, oblivious to the political tension swirling around him. And Calvin smiled, a real smile. Perhaps the first genuine smile he had worn in public in years. You know what's hardest for someone in my position, he said, addressing the reporter but speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. Admitting when we're wrong. The room went silent. The Yang Foundation is pleased to announce a commitment to fund Liberty Movement for the next 5 years. We'll also be building a permanent rehabilitation center based on the methodology developed by Dr. Williams and Ms. Rodriguez. Camera flashes exploded. Sophia let out a cry of surprise. Even Monica looked shocked. On one condition, Calvin added, looking directly at Monica. Ms. Rodriguez retains complete autonomy over the program and its methodology. No corporate interference, no board oversight, no strings attached. 3 months later, bulldozers broke ground on what would become the Liberty Movement Rehabilitation Center. It wasn't the most luxurious project the Yang Foundation had ever funded, but it was the most innovative. Every space was designed with input from the children and their families. Every piece of equipment was chosen by the people who would actually use it. And Calvin Yang showed up, not just once, not just for photo opportunities. He showed up regularly, walking the construction site, reviewing plans, asking questions. One afternoon, Monica found him in what would become the research library, frowning at a scientific article covered in Post-it notes. I never thought you'd show up to these meetings, she commented. Calvin rubbed his tired eyes. I never thought I'd have to study neuroplasticity at 50. But here we are. Monica sat down across from him. Is this part of your public penance, or do you actually care? Calvin was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Daniel asked to have his second brace removed last week. I know, he told me. His previous physical therapist said it would be impossible for at least 2 years. Monica smiled. But you fired her, remember? Because I told you she was discouraging him. And she was. Calvin pulled out his phone, showed Monica a photo. Daniel, balancing with only one crutch, his face bright with concentration. He's progressing faster than any traditional medical prediction, Calvin said softly. Not because of better equipment or more qualified therapists, but because someone finally let him lead. Why have you never accepted my apology? He asked suddenly. Monica tilted her head. Because you never wanted to apologize. You redirected resources. You changed policies. You funded our program. That's not an apology. That's compensation. Calvin nodded slowly. Fair enough. 6 months after that moment in the restaurant, the Liberty Movement Rehabilitation Center opened its doors. The contrast with that evening at the Sterling couldn't have been greater. The large, adapted space was filled with children, laughing, moving, dancing, children with wheelchairs, children with prosthetics, children with braces and crutches and walkers, all of them free. At the center of the main hall, Daniel led a small choreography routine with 3 other children. He wore only a light brace on his left leg now. His movements were still limited. They probably always would be, but they flowed with a confidence that no doctor had predicted. And Calvin watched from a distance, not interfering, not directing, not controlling, just watching his son bloom. He doesn't need you to hold him anymore, Monica said, approaching gently. No, Calvin agreed, but he still needs me to be around. Crucial difference. Calvin turned to face her, and for the first time there was no business transaction between them. No power dynamic, no manipulation or strategy. Just 2 people who had fought for the same thing, even if they'd started on opposite sides. Thank you, Calvin said simply. For what exactly? For teaching me to follow. A reporter approached. They were everywhere today, documenting the center's opening. Mr. Yang, how does it feel to see your son's progress? Calvin looked at Daniel, who had stopped his routine to help a young girl find her balance. Daniel's hands were gentle and patient. His voice was encouraging. Proud, Calvin said, not of what he's overcome, but of what he's created for others. And what has been the greatest lesson you have learned on this journey? Calvin Yang, billionaire businessman, man of power and influence, looked directly at the camera, and he said something he never thought he'd say. That true leaders aren't those who guide others down the path they believe is right, but those who have the humility to follow when someone shows them a better way. 1 year later, the Liberty Movement program had expanded to 3 new cities. Plans were in place for 5 more. Monica Rodriguez received the Pediatric Rehabilitation Innovation Award. Her methodology was being implemented in hospitals across the country. Universities were requesting her research. She'd been offered positions at prestigious institutions, but she stayed at Liberty Movement because it was never about prestige for her. It was about the children. Daniel Yang, now 11 years old, used only a light cane on difficult days. He'd enrolled in regular school, made friends, joined the drama club, and became a youth ambassador for Liberty Movement, traveling to speak at schools and hospitals, inspiring other children to find their own rhythm. And Calvin? Calvin learned the most difficult and valuable lesson of all. That true power isn't about control. It's not about money or influence or making things happen through sheer force of will. True power is knowing when to step back, when to follow, when to let someone else lead. Even if, especially if, that person is a 10-year-old boy with metal braces on his legs. You know, we live in a world where powerful people rarely change their perspectives, where those without power often remain in the shadows, invisible and unheard. But every once in a while, something breaks through. A moment, a gesture, a dance that lasts 30 seconds but changes everything. The story of Calvin Yang and Monica Rodriguez and young Daniel reminds us that transformation doesn't happen with grand declarations or massive donations or public apologies. It happens when we cross the invisible boundaries that separate us, when we choose dignity over comfort, when we choose connection over perfection, when we choose to follow instead of always needing to lead. It happens when a billionaire learns from a waitress, when a father learns from his son, when someone in power has the humility to admit they were wrong. Because the most profound revolutions don't begin with protests or legislation or billion-dollar foundations. They begin when someone has the courage to take an authentic first step, and when someone else has the wisdom to follow. That's what Monica taught Calvin in that restaurant. That's what Daniel showed his father every single day. That leading isn't always about being in front. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is step back and let someone else find their own way. Even if that way is slower, even if it's harder, even if it's not the path you would have chosen. Because in the end, it's not about the steps we take for others. It's about the steps we let them take for themselves. And sometimes, just sometimes, those steps change the world. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If this story touched your heart, remember we all have the power to be like Monica, to see dignity where others see inconvenience. And we all have the opportunity to be like Calvin, to learn, to grow, to admit when we're wrong, and choose a better path. The question is, will we have the courage to take that first step?